Hello again, members. Welcome back for another THF conversation. I'm Catherine McMacken, membership manager here at the Henry Ford, and I'm thrilled to share today's program with you. If you've been keeping an eye on Greenfield Village this year, you may have seen a new structure rising along Washington Boulevard between Main and State Streets. The vegetable building from Detroit's former Central Market is the first new building to be reconstructed in the village since the Roundhouse opened in 2000. And we can't wait to welcome you inside when it officially opens in 2022. Until then though, we'll talk with a panel of experts for a peek behind the scenes of the construction project with today's THF conversation, A Market Shed in its 160th year. We're so lucky to be joined by 3 special guests for this program, and I know you'll enjoy hearing from each one of them. Alec Jerome is our Director of Facilities Management. His career at the Henry Ford has spanned over 25 years, managing new construction and large capital projects for the institution. Alec's interest in the vegetable building and in the market began back in 2007 when he started to explore the possibility of reconstructing it here in the village while he studied for his master's degree in historic preservation. Next, we'll turn to Jim Johnson, Director of Greenfield Village and Curator of Historic Structures and Landscapes. Jim has been here at the Henry Ford since 1979, researching, planning, and presenting a wide variety of historic programs. He oversees the care and research of over 80 historic buildings and landscapes across our campus. Jim is a well-studied historian, and his interests in architecture, architectural history, and social history, especially American holidays, all support his work here at the Henry Ford. And finally, it's so great to welcome Deb Reed back again. Deb is our very own Curator of Agriculture and the Environment, and she loves to talk about the history of farming and rural life. She's thrilled to share what she's learning about market gardeners and their role in Detroit's vegetable building between 1861 and 1894. And she's absolutely enthused about the new offerings planned for the market building during the 2022 season in Greenfield Village. So I know we're in for a great program with this group. As always, while you enjoy the program, please submit any questions using the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen. We'll get to as many as we can at the end of the program. And of course, to our members, thank you again for your ongoing support of the Henry Ford. We are so grateful that you continue to connect with us and join us in our commitment to our mission as we activate new programming, new exhibits, and favorite experiences. So now I'll hand it over to the panel to take us over to the construction site in the village.
All right, thanks everybody for joining us today. What I'm going to do is kind of a quick overview of the history of the market itself and the building, the vegetable building that is making its triumphant return here in Greenfield Village. The image you see now is not our market. This is an image of a similar kind of setup at the back of City Hall in Montreal. But we're going to just kind of stay on the slide for a bit, and I'll do this overview, and then we're going to move through some images that show our market in its original location there in Detroit. By the time we get to the mid-19th century, the Detroit Central Farmers Market really was the economic and social heart of daily life in Detroit. And the original market, and when we talk about the market, we're talking about a district. Our building is just one component of what was called the Detroit Central Market. It was located at the east end of Michigan Avenue, just east of Woodward at Campus Martius. It was about 4 blocks square. It extended from Woodward to Randolph. The major building in the market was this huge vegetable shed, or this vegetable hall, this vegetable building. It was called by different things at different times. And this is where the farmers came in and set up their stalls and sold produce, in addition to all other kinds of vendors and different things that surrounded the area. The growth of the market really reflects the growth of Detroit as a city. And, much of Detroit's early history has everything to do with it being a port town. They're located on the Detroit River with connections to the Great Lakes. But during the 19th century, decade by decade, Detroit's manufacturing base, its population, everything grew really quickly, more than doubling every 10 years. So it starts out as about 2,000 people in 1830, and by 1860, it's over 45,000 people in population. So the Central Market was the first one in Detroit that was located away from the water, basically. And it shows really the shift from kind of water transport and the importance of that to the rise of the railroad and internal marketing and commerce and things like that. So the farmers who were coming to Detroit were no longer going to the port to shift their produce and things to the larger population centers to the east. They were now perfectly adequate to sell to the huge number of residents that were now residing in the city. So that had to do a lot with the big shift there. So as a result of all this, markets were developed and the Central Market rose, originally in 1843, as really kind of a simple setup right behind what the original city hall there in the area that I talked about. But that worked fine for a time, but again, populations grew, the demand grew, and developing problems started with traffic congestion caused by the market, and really to make the area really more functional, but also more presentable, more beautiful. So the newly elected mayor, Christian Buell, that's a name that you'll still see and hear around the city, was pledged to build a new covered market building. And the city hired an architect by the name of John Schaefer, who was a Bavarian fellow. And he designed really a structure that would end up being comprised of 48 iron columns supported by a wooden roof and measuring approximately 70 by 242 feet. And the contract was awarded to actually build it by a builder by the name of Joel Gray. And the cost, and this is in 1861 money, is $5,312. So by the time you get to late September of 1860, this is a quote from the Detroit Free Press. The new market building in the rear of the city hall is nearly completed and promises to be a fine structure. It covers the whole of the space occupied as a vegetable market and consists of an open shed, the roof of which is supported on iron columns and is a well-finished framework. The roof is of slate and costs about $1,500. It is designed in time to make a tile floor and erect fountains. The building will accommodate all the business of the market and will constitute an ornament as well as a great convenience to the important branch of city commerce. So really, that's a nice description, and that's really the beautiful building that we ended up having. So in the first year, 1861, it really performed really well, and it thrived decade by decade through the end of the 1880s, early 1890s. But then things began to change, and with the sort of the emergence of the Eastern Market, City Council decided to close the market in 1892. And in 1893, the Parks and Boulevards Commission, which operated Belle Isle, received approval to move the building to Belle Isle and use it for a horse and vehicle shelter. And the building was set up there in 1894. In later years, it was converted to a riding stable, and dramatic changes were done to that. And we'll see some images in a bit about that, where it was bricked in, a clear story, things were put on top of it. It really altered very quickly or immensely at that time period. It was used as a riding stable through 1963, and after that time, it was used for storage, and it kind of eventually went dormant and was more or less abandoned and went really into very poor condition and caught fire at least once that we know of. Over the course of the summer of 2003, the building was dismantled. We were able to acquire the building after we learned of its history, and it's really was threatened to be demolished at that time. And we purchased the building for $1 from the city of Detroit, and then dismantled it and brought it here on site, and where it stayed in storage for a while. So the images that we're seeing show the original market and the hustle and the bustle and really the daily life that was going on in and around it. We see some of the really wonderful details there of the structure. We heard about the combination of the cast iron combined with this timber frame roof structure and all that ornamentation. And you're seeing some pretty good examples of that right here with the sort of twisted cast iron columns, really to resemble a carved stone. Out of the top of the columns, it's still cast iron, but it was designed to look like really an extension of the timber framing itself. You can see just the different variety of things that would have been happening all the way around the market. Rents for renting things, depending which location, which space that you were in the market. This image is one of my favorite ones. The high point of this being the dude sleeping up on the roof there. That's just outstanding. So next slide, please. This is another view showing the market from probably one of the higher buildings to the other side. And what is behind the market there is a good example of the architecture of the period. This is the formal Central Market building, and this was constructed, completed around 1880 or so. It really was kind of the finishing touch on this district. And this housed the butchers and market offices and things like that. This building would have been demolished and not carted off to a landfill. All the bricks and things would have been reused somewhere else. But when that decision was made to end the market and change the area, this building came down, and the building that we have was relocated. Next slide, please. This is a wonderful image that we recently found in the collection. This is the Grand Army of the Republic encampment and parade dated 1891. In this case, we see the front of the Central Market building, and there to the back is the vegetable shed there in all its glory. Kind of the end of its life there in its original location. Next slide, please. So as we mentioned, the whole idea was to change the whole scale and scope of that region where the Central Market was located, beautify the area. So above we see, again, the main feature, the Central Market building there. And then below we see the results of the beautification approach to that area where the buildings have been removed, the boulevard has been created, and we see the soldiers and sailors monument erected in the early 1870s there in place. All right, next slide. So that gets us to Belle Isle, where the building was relocated. It started its life there looking very much like it did in Detroit. It was an open pavilion. It was a place where you could pull in horses and vehicles and different, things like that to shelter. But then that would change as the use of the building evolved into a formal riding stable there. And that's what we mentioned. The infill of the brick walls, a clear story added to it, and pretty significant alterations to the interior to create interior rooms, spaces, horse stalls, storage areas, all things like that. Okay, next slide. And here we have, upper left is probably, by the looks of it, 1970s era image of what the building looked like in Belle Isle. And then below is the condition of the building as we found it when assembly started in 2003 that winter. You can see some of the fire damage there on the front corner of the building. Okay, next slide. And some quick detail stuff of the interior, showing a lot of it that we see in these early images from Detroit still in place. A lot of stuff had gone missing or removed or changed, but you still can see some of the true elements still in place there. And then we've got some pictures of dismantling and things beginning to start. The image on the left is interesting. That's kind of the base of one of the original cast iron columns sitting on a limestone block, which would have been sort of the original foundation situation for those cast iron columns that supported the building. Okay, next slide. And then one last picture there of the interior just before dismantling occurred. You can see how the interior had been altered with the horse stalls and the storage areas and different kinds of things above that. So at this point, I'd like to turn over to Alec Jerome, and he's going to tell us a little bit about really the process of getting the building here and what we've done to get it back up here in Greenfield Village.
Great, thank you, Jim. I appreciate the opportunity to talk to everyone, and I'll apologize in advance. I don't do this very often, but I loved speaking about this building because it's such an incredible opportunity for the Henry Ford. And what you see in front of you right now is a rendering that was provided by Quinn Evans when we did our original concept drawings. We actually did these 10 years ago and then revised them. A lot of my discussion will focus on the challenges that we've encountered as we try to make a building that is code compliant and meets the structural requirements of today with materials and parts and pieces that don't meet up to those standards. And so that inherently has introduced a lot of challenges. Hopefully people had an opportunity, and Jim mentioned, you can see here that the clear story windows are not a part of this. That was a later addition on Belle Isle. And then a lot of the conversation today, and we'll go to some subsequent slides, will focus around the a moment frame and how we actually can construct this building so that it stands up and meets, as I say, code. You might have, Jim had mentioned the infill of some of the walls at Belle Isle, and I think that was, Deb, if you wanted to jump back to that first photo of Belle Isle. One more. You'll see that a lot of the, obviously the use of the building changed, as Jim had indicated. It was more of in its traditional form when it first came over to Belle Isle, but as they added rooms and partitions and changed the functionality of it, they also added these walls on the exterior of it. We actually think that that also might have been a result of structural concerns that they were having with the cast iron. If you go to the next slide, Deb, and Jim shows a fragment here. Two things you'll notice: cast iron is extremely brittle, and it will shear. And so as the life of this building goes along, there's a recognition that there is a concern with the longevity and safety and the structural integrity of these cast iron columns. The second thing I'll also have everyone notice is that you can see that the bottom, this isn't obviously the full pole, but you'll see the bottom at least 2.5 feet. And this was the case at Belle Isle, were actually underground, and those are actually decorative elements. Those would have been above ground on that limestone base. So if Deb, if you could go forward to the Quinn Evans rendering, and then next to the next slide, which is, you'll see here, so this is in process. We're pouring the foundations for the cast iron and steel, and I will get back to that. And this is in regards to that moment frame / building of the structure. But one of the things that we found to be quite challenging is that obviously when we are using this building today, we need to use it in a different, we're using it for similar functions, but we need more amenities. So this is just a small sampling of the conduit that we're having to introduce. And so we had to figure out a way to get electrical into all of these columns, which are approximately 20 feet apart, so that we can support programs and other activities that would be happening in the market. And that in itself, in order to do that and be sympathetic to the preservation standards that we are trying to adhere to, and the Secretary of Interior standards for preservation, that was a trick. So moving on to the next slide. You can see here just, and this is just very briefly, what's required in that pier to hold this building up. And it is a myriad of resteel and rebar, as well as anchor bolts, because we're going to have to attach steel and cast iron to hold this structure up. And you can also envision the difficulty of trying to introduce electrical conduit up through this maze of resteel in order to accomplish and get electrical into the different areas of the columns. Next slide. Here's another shot of that. And the reason I include this is now we're going to have a discussion about the moment frame. And the moment frame, I'm going to try to make this in pretty easy terms. So if everyone can envision an umbrella, if you have an umbrella and you hold it in front of you, you have the wind pushing against it, and there's a large force associated with that. If you have the umbrella holding it in front of you and you had a large wind, it would pull it up. So we were stuck with the dilemma of how do we hold this building in place so that it stays and is structurally sound and can withstand all the loads of snow and the forces of wind. So one of the ideas we did was to do what they did at Belle Isle. Do we enclose portions of this with a lateral shear wall that holds it up and holds it down at the same time? We diverged from that because we wanted to make sure that we felt that that took away from the integrity of the original structure. So then we came up with the opportunity to create a superstructure on the top of the cast iron in order to hold it down and make sure that it was functioning as a structural building. That unfortunately added a lot of structural steel into the canopy, which was a detriment to the original timber framing because it was having to push it up, eliminate it, and actually modify it significantly so that it wasn't really in tune with the integrity that we are seeking with in terms of our preservation efforts. So finally, we settled and we actually changed and went with a different structural engineer. And we took this umbrella and we flipped it upside down and buried it. So what you're seeing in this photo is, and you see trenches that go off to the right of these pier bases, is the starting of our moment frame. Deb, if you go to the next slide. Here's an overhead shot. So essentially what we ended up doing is these are all, and you can see the literal steel is incredible in these areas, and these were poured then as slabs, as a footing. So we essentially took this entire halo of structural requirements in order to hold the building, and we buried it underground. So it is invisible to anyone. But yet still will function now and hold the building down and hold the building up and hold it in place in perpetuity. So that's one of the things that we did is we were struggling to try to figure out how do we keep this building the way that we want it to be and to make it look the way that it should. Going on to the next slide. So a couple of the compromises that we have to make is that a lot of the members that when they came from Belle Isle were no longer structurally integral. They could not be used any longer. So what we did is, and this is all going to be painted, so we did have that advantage, but we were able to take and add structural bracing in order to supplement the structural integrity. And then if you'll look at the long diagonal beam that runs along the middle of this photograph, and I think Deb's going to highlight that, great. That is actually a laminated beam. So we actually had to glue up and create laminated beams for those members that no longer existed. However, you'll notice also in that photo, there are a number, and we were able to use, we're guesstimating approximately 80% of the original members for the structural timber frame. And any members that we no longer had or had a section that weren't compatible, we actually reused those for some of the struts and the bracing. So we really made every effort to save original material and demonstrate that and use it in the building. Going on to the next slide. Something as simple as this. So we talked about the electrical and incorporating that into a building of this size and scale and making sure that it's available for gym and programs and everyone else in the village. But what do you want that base to be? And we had to debate that. So we initially had round bases, but how do you put a square electrical box in a round base? We actually ended up taking a look at and making that this base actually mimics the original base of the cast iron columns. So if you go to the next slide, here's the cast iron, and you'll see down at the very bottom, you'll see, so we tried to reference the language of the cast iron in the actual pier itself so that there's some continuity. This also will demonstrate the fact that all of the area and the leaf decoration, that was all buried in the shot that Jim had shown you earlier. So to give you an idea, we had to determine how how high this building need to be. What do we need to do? How do we create the structural integrity of these columns? Quickly going to the next guy. I know I'm going on. I could talk forever about this, but I'll circle back to the moment frame. So in order to hold the moment frame in place, and we talked about the deficiency of cast iron, you'll actually see a row of cast iron that's in the background. And in the foreground here, you have a steel column. So we have two sets of steel columns that are of 4 each that are holding my umbrella up. And that's what we've incorporated. You'll notice that we try to reference, just like I spoke earlier, the fluted gussets at the top, which are reminiscent of the cast iron, but we never want to copy and recreate a modern technology and make it look old. We wanted to acknowledge that we were making these modifications in order to make sure that it was structurally integral and could be built to today's standards. So those were very important in that process. And then next slide. Just very quickly, one of the other things that we ended up doing, and it's difficult to see in this slide, but you'll notice some diagonal screws that are going down between one rafter and another. And essentially what that ended up doing is we've taken two members, tied them together, and created a truss that works as a unit so that we can construct, and instead of having an 8x8 beam, you've now made it 16, 24 inches deep, and you're adding all that structural strength to the building. We've done that throughout, but that's one of the other concessions that we made so that you can see that, but it allows us to use the original timber frame members, which we would not have been able to, building code, no other parameters being in place, but we were able to engage a third-party engineer that was able, timber frame specialist, that really took an adventurous look at this that was still compliant with all the structural codes of the day, but was open-minded and allowed us to really be able to save this building in the manner in which we really wanted to do and preserve it. So I think next slide, and I think Deb, I will turn it over to you. You're on mute.
My mouse is not cooperating, but thank you, Jim, for providing a great overview to the historic structure. Thank you, Alec, for giving a good overview of all of the underground and behind the scenes of the reconstruction process. What I'm hoping to do is share what is also hidden, and that is the historical research that goes into the evidence, the documentation for the programming that Jim and his team will roll out in 2022. One of the bits of the behind the scenes is the simple act of being an expert in traditional skills. And to the right, taking the photograph, is Laura Sager, who is the life partner and corporate partner of Rudy Christian and Christian and Sons, who were the timber framers who worked on this project, both in the deconstruction that you heard Jim discuss and in its reconstruction this summer and ongoing. They finished at the end of July, if I'm not mistaken, but this was raising the last of those diagonal beams that Alec had mentioned. They are part of a long list of experts and tradition bearers who have made this building possible. And without going into all the detail, one of the outcomes of historical research is actually compiling the list of who's who. So from the architect who trained at St. Ludwig's Academy in Munich, to Joel Gray, who was an engineer on a railroad, and local crockery merchants who provided the gas lights, painters and whitewashers, and carpenters who built the tables, which are also called the stands and the stalls. their work is preserved in various ways in the 50% of original columns and 75-ish% of original timber frame materials that make this building possible. The Laura Sager and Rudy Christian are pictured there. They are what Alice Waters calls the market raisers. And Alice Waters is who has inspired an effort here at the Henry Ford to launch an edible education program with this market building as the hub of Greenfield Village's edible schoolyard. And Jim is co-chair of that project. Alec and I both work with that. And we're really excited to share more on that in the future. It's still in development. But this building that Jim mentioned is a hub of activity, the front side being the side on Randolph Street that you see here, and an identical side being there right behind the market, the Central Market building, was a bit of a conundrum in terms of who goes where as you read the names in the historic record. Where are the florists? Where do you go to buy fruits and vegetables? The fishmongers exist where? And so through reading 30 plus years of historic documents about the building, the newspapers, the city council minutes, court cases, disputes that went before the police and the local courts, it helped determine the florists were on the south side, and you see them here, so that when the building is activated next April 2022, when Jim and crew officially launch it, we'll know that those florists need to be facing the side that will be towards Edison Illuminating to represent their positioning in the original structure. Market gardeners were on the Randolph end, hucksters who were the middlemen and women who sold what the market gardeners or the florists or the horticulturalists or the orchardists grew. The hucksters sold that also to customers. And then the fishmongers were on the north and the east side. All around the building were day laborers jockeying for position to get attention from the passersby. And this was a rowdy place right in the heart of the city, as Jim explained, with campus marshes and the through streets bringing folks together, all of Detroit. So it's a story that can tell about hundreds of thousands of people over the 30 years that it served as a market. Trying to figure out who we feature in those stories is it's a richness that you rarely have an opportunity to explore. So that illustration from about 1875 in the upper left there shows a wood cutting from an original stereograph. And if you hone in on it, you can see some of the women who had a little pop-up stand outside of the structure, which meant they may have avoided paying the normal fee to be a licensed vendor in the market. Nope, they were on the outskirts, subject to the elements, the wind and the rain. But that could very well be Mary Judge right there, who may also be the person illustrated here selling flowers in the spring market in 1891 and 2, right before the building was officially closed and close to the time where it was officially dismantled. Mary Judge will be the focus of a dramatic presentation, the script written with the input of 4 students from the University of Michigan in a museum capstone project. And, one of those students was able to work with us throughout the summer on exploring what was available in any given month and plotting the strategies to actually implement regular seasonal markets for the village to deliver during the 2022 season for the first time. And then to the far right is one of those whitewashers, a job that Black Detroiters were proud of holding, as were some other immigrant groups, including the Poles. And there's wonderful information in the newspapers, the backs and the forths and the commentary between the different day laborers and the different whitewashers about who did the best job and how they sold their services to the customers that came through. So we have received a grant from the Americana Foundation to develop a second dramatic presentation focused on the market. And that will be about Ben Hockley, who is one of the Black Detroiters who happened to make a living whitewashing and plastering in the city, and who is in the record as also whitewashing the interiors of the market and the Central Market butcher stands. So Greenfield Village will be very visible within the market as well. Many asked during summer stroll, as they saw the building close up for the first time, would we be able to buy things from the Firestone fields? Well, stay tuned. Maybe, it depends. Maybe not the first year. It's a good lesson in agriculture and the limited ability, right, of limited land, and you can't produce exponentially more. But certainly the fields and the expert presenters there will tie into the whole overview that the market is designed to interpret. Historical artifacts in our collection will also enliven this, as this hand cart in collections already is somewhat visible in some of the movable market wagons that are in the village. And then last but not least is the work that Ayanna Curran-House did, one of those 4 Michigan students who had worked on the Mary Judge dramatic presentation. Ayanna was a Simmons intern this summer. She really developed the plan for the actual market that will be launched and will grow through the 2020 season. This is very ambitious. It has involved a cross-divisional team in doing this strategic planning. It will require initial and sustained conversations with growers within the city and beyond, and other vendors to help make this a reality that we can use to talk about local markets historically and today, the path forward of grower-consumer exchange, and the ability to bring these educational content about everything from regenerative agriculture to food security to our members and our guests. And we have many big ideas, with the central one being transforming relationships between consumers and the origins of their food by focusing on immersive historic market educational experiences. So next spring, we look forward to being able to share this card from one of Detroit's own Ferry and Company trade cards, replicated from the Henry Ford's collection, and engaging with you at the market. For more, you can learn about the fundraising efforts with the Carver Carson Society. And I am sure that I have used up my time, and I'm eager to hear questions and also listen to Alec and Jim's answers. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Deb and Alec and Jim, for this really, really wonderful program. The reconstruction is coming along, and I can't wait for the opening in 2022. It's such an exciting thing for the village and for all of our members and guests. So like Deb said, we have time for a few questions. We have a few submitted already. So folks, please do keep sending those in using the Q&A tool at the bottom of the screen. So now let's get started with some of those. And the first one, let's start with this question for Deb. Can you explain why this isn't called a farmer's market?
The city officials called it a public market. And that means that the city invested in it. They actually owned it and they operated it with some fairly strict regulations and specifications that the vendors who paid the fees to be licensed to sell had to abide by. They did this to protect the health and well-being of their citizens. A farmer's market is technically owned and operated by farmers, or perhaps a cooperative that the farmers, contribute to, as might others. So that's just the technical difference between the two. There will be farmers selling growers at the market as it grows in the village, but the market in Detroit was the vegetable building was a focus for farmer produce, but there were also other things sold there. So hopefully that answers that question.
Yeah, thank you. It's such an interesting kind of nuance in the terms, and I think that's come up quite a few times. So thank you for that explanation. The next question, I think this is probably going to be one for Jim or maybe Alec. Megan asks, have you been offered other buildings since 2000? If so, what made this one different in deciding to accept it?
I can answer. Occasionally we do get the offer of different structures, and this one really spoke to us just because of all the things that have unfolded. And at the time we accepted it, we knew a fraction about what we do now about the building, and even then it was an intriguing, really, we thought, important thing to bring into the collection. But we're so glad we did, because as the story of this building unfolds, it's just becoming richer and richer, and we're still finding things all the time. And Alec can speak to this too, but bringing a new historic structure into the village is a large and very expensive undertaking. And the laws and different things about removing historic structures are very strict these days. You can't just go shopping and get something, or even if somebody wants to donate it, there may be laws and things that prevent it from being removed from its original location. But as in the introduction that Kat said, this will be our first new historic structure in the village since the Roundhouse opened in 2000.
Well, thanks for that, Jim. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I saw one of the questions. This also relates to where it is in the village. We don't have a shot of that, but this is on a block that houses Hank's Silk Mill and the Mulberry Grove, and the rest of it was it wasn't unused, but it was unpopulated by buildings next to the Edison Illuminating and the Roundhouse. And part also of looking at structures and introducing them into the village is literal land area. We don't have that many spaces that can accommodate a new structure, and especially, one of the really neat things about this is what we had, the area that was underutilized, but it also can accommodate so many new functions that we're going to be able to use it for during our programming season at the Henry Ford.
That's such a good point about the literal space in the village. I always think of it as being so big, 80 acres. But when you think of how big each individual building is, there is a little bit of Tetris maybe that goes into getting all those buildings in there. Let's stay with you, Alec. I think this next question is also going to be for you. Rob asks, were the gas lanterns converted to electricity before moving the building to Belle Isle?
Actually, I think that would be better for Deb, and I believe they were, but go ahead, Deb. You're muted, Deb.
Heavens, the gas fixtures may not have been converted to electricity, but electricity was installed in the building. Jim, was it 82? It's what I seem to remember.
Might be a bit later, but it likely would have been commercial grade arc lighting that was most commonly seen in industrial and urban areas in that time period.
And we're also not sure what those original gas fixtures look like, but the city council authorized 6 of them and that to be installed in the middle of the building. And that was as of 1860. So it's a great example of the ways that a city also used its new technologies. It was a showplace to feature innovation.
And if you remember that giant ladder in that one wonderful image, those were commissioned as well to be able to get up into the area where the lights were to turn them on and off, because they had to be manually lit and manually turned off.
I'm going to try to go back up here where we can actually look at there I went at the building.
That was gorgeous. And this next question, I think is maybe for any one of you guys. It looks like most of the construction up to this point is fresh wood. How much of the current construction is original to the 1800s building in Detroit versus a replica or replacement?
That's about 75 to 80% actually is the original timber frame structure. There was a fire in this building at one point, which added to some of the deterioration of some of the members. And you'll actually notice relatively very few. The hip jacks had to be replaced. That was the one laminated beam that I had demonstrated and shown individuals. But all of the other elements, the preponderance of them are all original materials that were salvaged and then either and or used in their original absolute location. Some of them were modified, but using original materials to meet some of the older components. If a portion of it was rotted out on the end of it, you'll notice actually when you'll be able to come and visit this, we have introduced scarf joints and other methods and repair methodology that have allowed us, and especially with Christian and Sons expertise in timber frame structures, to save all of these components. All of those, if we had gone with different structural methodologies that were presented that I discussed, would have eliminated those to a proportion I would have guessed in the neighborhood of 20 to 30%. 50% of the original materials would have been forfeited. So that's why we took this direction. It took a little bit longer. It's taken some additional funds. But it's really allowed us to stick to our preservation tenets that we're trying to uphold in the village. And as we talked about that push-pull with introducing electrical, with introducing lighting. I didn't even mention, how do you get light? How do you get electric up into the canopy of the building? Jim showed a wonderful photo, and it's hard to see on this one, but you had this wonderful system of gutters and downspouts that were able to conduct this load of all of the rain coming down on the slate roof. We are actually going to be hiding inside one of the downspouts and the conductors down. Our electrical is going to go up, so you'll never see it. But these are the challenges that we've tried to rise to in order to make sure that at all times we're trying to adhere as much as possible to the architectural integrity of this building and really present it the way that it was.
And the finish you're seeing on the current beams, all the original bits, is a result of the lead abatement, the removal of layers and layers and layers of lead paint from all the original structures. So it's evened everything out, and everything is, as Alec mentioned, is going to get painted. So significant paint analysis is taken with this original stuff, and we are hoping for some exciting polychrome, lots of different colors. What the harsh, painful reality is the building was painted in industrial brown colored paint that had a zinc base to it that was all about getting it covered and getting it protected. So despite all that ornamentation, the color, there's an official name for the color, but we sort of internally refer to it as disappointing brown. But there also will be some infill that's light colored, cream colored as well to reflect light from the beaded ceiling that will be in the building and some of the infill on the front.
Yeah, it's a Munsell brown, and it actually is a very unique paint because it has a zinc pigment, which was unusual at its time. But Jim is correct. It is not nearly as dynamic as one would have envisioned it to be. It's very, it's a brown.
It's disappointing, yes.
And if I could also just chime in that the interior
Yeah.
ceiling would have been white, and the city commissioners indicated it was white pigment, white lead paint, and that'll help reflect light back down. So inside hopefully won't be as dark a space.
Yeah, minus the lead this time.
The first time I'm hearing about disappointing brown and the lead. There's so many interesting challenges to balance, you know, between the structural engineering and the historic preservation and the disappointing colors. So that's incredible what you guys have brought to life even yet so far. We have another great question. Keith asks, were similar buildings built at the time in other cities? In other words, is this style or type of market shed unique to Detroit?
This is an extremely unique building, and it's got a lot of reasons for that. First of all, it combines a fairly new technology of cast iron with the traditional form of timber framing for the roof structure. Second, it was commissioned by an architect. Typically, utilitarian buildings, not that there was any less skill or importance, but a timber framer typically would sort of oversee the design and oversee the construction. And then thirdly, it had a builder that would have held the people doing the actual work to certain standards. So the combination of things make this a fairly unique building, and it's absolutely a survivor. So these types of buildings did not survive in urban environments. They burned, they were torn down, they were removed. This one clearly had enough value to the city that the effort was made to dismantle it, which would have been no small task, and move to Belle Isle and put it back up. It was not put back up as nicely as it was originally built. There's a lot of nails got used in putting it back together instead of the traditional mortise and tenon, but it was saved nonetheless.
And for any member who wants to read more about markets of this era and in general, Helen Tangiers has 2 books on public market buildings. So you can get a sense of this is rather unique for all the reasons Jim explained. And there were a lot of cities that needed to have market buildings like this. So there were a few others that have cast iron, but as Jim said, they don't survive. But Tangiers has gone through and found a lot of photographs of them. So you can flip through that beautiful picture book and see how it compares.
Yeah. Thanks for that tip. Now, I think this may actually end up being about our last question based on what we have time for today. So this is a little bit looking ahead, but also kind of getting to the strategic way that we'll present this building once we do open it. Megan asks, was there ever consideration of interpreting the building or part of it as its time as a horse stable, or was it always planned to represent the initial market era?
Right from the get-go, the intent was to return it to its 19th century appearance. So it spent a few years in the 1890s as the riding shelter, but the stable thing came much later. So really the original plan, and we've stuck with that, is to use it as the public market building.
And that would align with the period of significance, which is the preservation perspective that you apply to a particular building. So the period of significance, although it was used as a horse stable, that was not, wouldn't be identified as its period of significance, but rather as the farmer's market.
Again, I would also just add that the building was part of a new movement when it went to Belle Isle, because it was about building these public parks and providing health and well-being to the users of the park. But as both Jim and Alec indicated, the Henry Ford had the plan from the beginning to have this as the hub of new foodways and edible education kind of effort.
You know what, we are going to squeeze in one more question. This one's for me. Now that I know about Disappointing Brown and some of the other extra challenges of the project, I just want to know really briefly from each of the three of you, what was the best part? Maybe something surprised you or was just an absolute joy that you came across through this whole process.
I can start. It's the people's stories. They're just amazing. We keep finding new ones, and some of the things that are survived that took place there, including the great cucumber war of 1860. What was it, Deb? The terrible food fight took place.
For me, it was just from a preservation aspect, and the day that we were able to figure out an alternate means of holding this building down and in place and coming up with our new moment frame methodology and signifying that we were able to really save this building the way that it was intended to be was just one of those awesome days that we stumbled upon very, very strategically, but stumbled upon it nevertheless.
And the evidence of farming in the city, it is amazing when you begin to find individuals on maps, and there they are in the city directory as a huckster or a market gardener, and here's the land they had on this 1876 plat map, and there's a whole community around them that also tend the soil. That's amazing.
Outstanding. Well, thank you. And I can't wait to see all of those stories as they sort of come to life. And I am really hoping that there's going to be a dramatic presentation of the Great Cucumber War. So, Jim, keep us posted. Well, but I think that's all we have time for today. So just, of course, thank you again, Jim, Alec, Deb, all of our members for joining us for today's program. You all know we love to share our passion for history and for the Henry Ford with our members. And we're just so grateful that you keep connecting with us here in these kinds of virtual programs and back on site, of course, as well. Now, if you enjoyed today's virtual program, I hope to see you again at our next virtual program in September, when we'll be taking a deep dive into the Henry Ford's quilt collection. So finally, as we wrap up, thank you again to all of our members for all that you do to support the Henry Ford. And I can't wait to see you next time.